United we're as strong as a mountain. United.
My name's Bob Carnegie. I'm a working class activist. It's trade unions. I'm still a member of a trade union. I'm an honorary member, life member of the ETU, and I'm still a member of the Maritime Union. My talk today is 1985. Underlining that is SEQEB, and it's an historical and personal perspective of the dispute. And to go near the SEQEB dispute, I think it's important that we look at it in the perspective of what was happening not only in Queensland and Australia, but around the world during the lead up to 1985. Time, as we know, only heads in one direction. We can't go back, but it's our task to try to understand what the history is and come up with some ideas and come up with some understanding of what happened in the past so that we can learn from it, and also perhaps learn not to repeat the same mistakes that were made during that time, particularly during 1985, where the trade union movement suffered some really enormous and life-altering defeats. My talk today is as a long-time working-class activist and a left-wing activist in particular. I come from a sort of like an IWW. It used to be an IWW Stalinist background. It turned then into an IWW Trotskyist background, which, funny enough, made me less popular than being less popular. But that's just the way it is, I guess. You're better off dying in your bed than with an ice pick through your head, I guess. In attempting to understand this dispute, it's important to look at the political, ideological, industrial and economic factors that brought this dispute on, and why 1985 was such a critical year for the Australian labour and the trade union movement. And it set up a generation more of assaults upon working class people in this country. I also asked the question of what, as Claire alluded to, was what become of working class activists after these big disputes? What happens to the SEQEB workers and their families? What happens to many of us who are on picket lines and who fought the good fight for working class justice and freedom? As I said before, it's important that this dispute isn't looked at in isolation. During the early 80s, a tsunami had been building. A tsunami of anti-working class activity was building across not only Queensland and Australia, but around the whole Western world, particularly in the English-speaking countries of the United States and Great Britain. But also economic factors were at play here. Japan was in a state of maximum growth. And I think, and I'll just touch on it very, very briefly, the Japanese model of just-in-time economic model of manufacturing, particularly that was developed by, it was called Toyotaism. It's never looked upon much by labour historians or labour activists about what that actually meant. What that actually meant was mass subcontracting out, because the products have to be at the factory door just in time to be assembled, not to be manufactured. So that's an important thing, and Japan was on a huge economic growth trajectory during the 60s, the 70s and the 80s. I'm not going to try to go over old ground. So but we have to remember what was happening in the early 80s. Reagan had just been elected. Jimmy Carter had been defeated in the US presidential elections. Reagan comes to power. One of his first major acts is the sacking of 13,000 air traffic controllers. A lot of us here will remember the sights of air traffic controllers being put in handcuffs and being led away from their jobs. Their union was called PATCO at the time. This started a wave of anti-trade, of anti-unionism in the US that we hadn't seen since the 1920s and 30s. It started away, actually some new industries came out of it. One was union busting. Professional union busters started renting out spaces in massive office blocks in some of the big cities. The Reagan economic theory was one that came out of the Chicago School of Economics from Milton Friedman and co. with their, for want of a better word, the prostitution of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, in which they continually talked about Adam Smith and about how he believed in the individual rights and individual freedoms were the only things that were worthy of, and that's how capitalism went forward. What they didn't write about and didn't honestly tell people was that Adam Smith believed in regulatory bodies that looked over banks, for example. And so in that regard, Friedman and his team were actually charlatans. The other thing that happened with Reagan, which is, I think, interesting, is that apart from this theory of this economic theory that he pushed so powerfully, was this massive military build-up. In some perverted way, it was almost a Keynesian military build-up. It was so massive in its effect on the economy, and unemployment for a brief period in the Reagan administration went down because of this massive amount of money that was being spent on defence. However, in the end, these policies in the early 80s led to what we call rust belts, and we saw the rapid shuttering of major parts of the US economy that manufactured and built things, particularly around the Great Lakes areas and down Pennsylvania, and they became and are still today rust belts. If we looked from a bit more to the, I think it's the east, from Washington DC, we come across the island of Britain. I won't call it Great Britain. I certainly won't call it the United Kingdom. Thatcher had just been elected in 1979. Her theories that she took on were similar to Reagan's, but they were much more monetarist and less, and in some respects, much more aggressive than even Ronald Reagan's. She took on her task with utter ruthlessness. And I think one of the things that we forget is that it wasn't the British miners that were lined up first, or the British dockers, or whatever. It was, in fact, a convener, a single person, a man by the name of Derek Robinson, who was his nickname was Red Robbo, and he was the chief convener for the Leyland Longbridge plant in just outside of Birmingham in the Midlands of England. Now, Longbridge has a long and very great history in the union movement, and so did Red Robbo. He did his apprenticeship at Longbridge. In 1951, he was elected as a shop steward, and by 1979, he and his team had developed a workplace that was quite unique in its militancy. During 1976 to 1979, there were 531 work stoppages at Longbridge, which almost beat the record of a ship I was on once, but not quite. And I was the lead delegate, I'm proud to say. But what happened with Red Robbo was that he was sacked, and he was sacked because of a leaflet that he had authored. And the leaflet talked about why it was necessary to keep producing productive items in the Longbridge plant rather than it to be shut down, and shut down and mass automation to take place. The grounds for his dismissal was just this leaflet, and it was a puzzling turnout. Workers took strike action. but the company wouldn't bend, and the company was just like the air traffic controllers in the United States. It was a publicly owned company. It was owned by the state, Leyland, at that stage. In 1975, it had been nationalised by the then Labor government. So Robinson is sacked, and this leads on to a whole range of attacks upon the British working class, including Longbridge, as I mentioned just before. In the 1960s, Longbridge was the biggest car factory in the world. It's not well known. Most people would have thought it was something in Japan or in the United States, but Longbridge was the biggest. That particular part of the Midlands employed 250,000 people in the car industry. And almost overnight, tens and hundreds of thousands of jobs were obliterated by Thatcher and her cronies. The time is now, the whole idea was you stick your head out, you'll get your head knocked off. And it was a very effective tool in trying to cow the British working class. 1984 comes around, and in March 1982, in Yorkshire, a pit is to be closed, and it's going to be the first of 20 pits that are to be closed by the National Coal Board, another state-owned industry. Coal was a nationalised industry in Britain in 1984. 1984 comes about, and the miners, under the leadership of Arthur Scargill, decide to take the British state on. And for the next year, most of us here who would remember the British miners, I remember the slogan about digging deep for the miners, is that we all chipped in and were transfixed by this immense working class struggle that was taking place in Britain. But we were also horrified by what happens when the full force of the state is unleashed against a union, even one as united and one as militant and one as powerful and one as strong as the NUM. And by 12 months later, by March 1985, the miners had been fundamentally broken, and they were forced back to work under the same agreement, but with an accelerated pit closure. Today, there are virtually no coal mines in Great Britain. I think there might be one or two. The National Union of Miners isn't a union anymore. In fact, sadly, the National Union Miners' main job now is to do compensation claims for retired miners. So let's now talk about turn our eyes to our country in the early 80s. I think there are some critical points leading up to 1985. The first one is that I think, and probably the most important one, is that in March that year, Bob Hawke's elected. He swears off the drink for 11 years or so, however long he was in power for 9 years. And him and Keating become the power duo of the nation. But they bring along, very sadly, the ACTU with them and develop what was called the Prices and Incomes Accord. One thing that we can, I think, if we look back soberly at the Prices and Income Accord, those of us of the left, and that includes myself, I knew, because of my broken down Stalinist path, I knew Pat Clancy as a young man. I knew Tom McDonald. I'd stayed at Tom and Audrey McDonald's little holiday cottage in the on the Central Coast. I knew, I didn't know Laurie Carmichael very well because he was from the metal workers and was a Euro-communist from the Communist Party of Australia, and hence condemned before our very eyes. But that's sort of like a joke. But or something. But anyway, so the left unions go with the right unions, and they come up with this price as an income accord, which basically reflects Australia Reconstructed. That was a metalworkers paper that came out in the late 70s or early 80s, I think, when Australian manufacturing was in a massive decline that it still hasn't recovered from. But under some lunatic observation by these people is that they thought they were going to turn Australia into some type of Sweden, that Scandinavian social democracy and economics was going to be the saviour of Australia. Well, I happen to have lived in Denmark before this, and I can tell you that Denmark and Sweden aren't one bit like Australia. The countries are completely different culturally, politically, socially, you know. They're just, the economies are based on knowledge. Even then they were knowledge economies. They were completely different countries than this country, and to think you could turn Australia into a sort of a Sweden was beyond my idea. But we swallowed the hook and went along with it, and this put union leadership into cahoots with the federal government, and that led to many, many problems. And it led to huge problems in industrial relations in this country. Because what effectively happened, and I can tell you this because I actually as a young man observed these people, is that sadly many union leaders are seduced by power and the proximity of power. You know, from being someone who was banging your head against the wall against Malcolm Fraser or Robert Menzies for most of your life, and all of a sudden you're sitting around the table with the Prime Minister, it's a type of seduction that occurs. These people fell for it, hook, line and sinker, and thought that they would know better than anyone else, that they could run a top-down type of trade unionism, that they knew all the answers, the rank and file knew nothing, and this caused huge problems for us. Australia's, in 1983, 51% of the workforce was in unions. There were 300 different trade unions in Australia in 1983. Today, there's 21 unions, 19 of which 19 have 98% of the coverage of unions left. Union coverage overall is 12%, from 51 to 12, and in the private sector it's down to less than 8. So, and the fundamental reason I put that down to are parts of the accord that were put into place, including another idiotic idea, which was amalgamating unions into huge organisations. And if we look, you know, that's a story for another day, not today. But for example, unions that have been very successful haven't gone down that huge amalgamation process. And one example is the ETU. They've kept their core alive. Number two, in Queensland, it's little discussed. It's little discussed in the labour movement, this huge dispute. And that was, those that once again would remember, do you remember the wide comb dispute in 1983, the AWU, the big wide comb dispute? Now, the wide comb dispute was an automation technology argument. It was about, the wide comb was used in New Zealand by shearers in New Zealand. Because shearers in New Zealand, I know a little bit about this because I used to have a great mate of mine in the 80s called Bugs, who was an alcoholic shearer who used to come and drink down to the Pineapple Hotel when he was on the drink, and I got to know him very well. But he was a man who went through the 1956 shearers' strike. And anyway, he explained the whole problems with wide combs is that they're 1.25 inches, which is about 34 millimetres wider than a normal narrow gauge comb. The difference was you could shear a sheep about 2 minutes faster with a wide comb than you could with a standard shear. However, merinos were different sheep than what were shorn in New Zealand. If you're not merinos, Australian sheep as wool is normally used for apparel and for blankets and whatever. New Zealand sheep used to always be mainly for carpets and textiles. So this dispute erupted. There was a 6-week national strike called by the AWU. In December 1983, the dispute was over because the Commission ruled in favour of the wide combs. And this led from a heavily unionised industry within a few quick years to becoming fundamentally deunionised with conditions collapsing back to what they were pre the Second World War. And that is still the case today in shearing in Australia, where the conditions are much less than what they were nearly 100 years ago because of this. But this dispute was also marked by extreme violence. There were fights all the time. There were fights that were on TV. Every little pub in outback Queensland or outback New South Wales, there were fights in it between union shearers and non-union shearers. People who wanted to keep using the standard comb and people who didn't. But it wasn't reported, and it's not really remembered now. It was another defeat, but it was a critical defeat because it was about automation, and it was also about what can happen to an industry when it's sort of like an unfettered automation can come into it, even though it was in a rural industry away from us. And also the violence. It's the same sort of violence that was involved in the shearers' strike had been happening in any of other industries in Australia, played out in the major cities. There would have been hell to pay about it. But I just think it's important that we think about that. And then before we get into 1985, and I'm sorry for taking so much time, but I think it's important, is that in 1984, there's a snap election called in New Zealand. The Longy Labor government's elected, and then comes the real banger, Rogernomics, where overnight he turns New Zealand into a laboratory for the new right. Overnight, some unions lose 80% of their membership within 6 months. Some unions are put out of business. Awards are completely deregulated. State-owned enterprises are immediately sold. The financial markets are totally deregulated. And that leads us into 1985 and the SEQEB dispute. As all of us know, the SEQEB dispute was fundamentally about the subcontracting out of an industry. The ETU's position was that they believed that a dangerous, highly skilled industry should not be led to subcontracting out, not just because of job losses and union membership losses, but because of safety and skill levels that were involved. In February 7th, there'd been arguments going on for some years in this industry. On February the 7th, the Peterson regime declares a state of emergency, and on February the 11th, 1985, he sacks 1,007 lines people. There's the trade union movement responds in the power sector by rolling blackouts. Any of us who were around in Brisbane during that time will all remember it. For 14 days there was, hour on, hour off blackouts. Some people were whinging about it. Some people thought it was great. I got asked on the radio the other day, it's not a way to put people on side. I said, well, not every industrial dispute is about putting people on side. Sometimes you have to take powerful industrial action to try to get a result, and that was the case. So for 14 days, the economy of Queensland was in tatters. Peterson from the information a lot of us had heard, was he was on the verge of almost on the verge of a breakdown, and I heard that Vince Lester was on the verge of getting a brain, which would have been something new. Yeah, never. You couldn't have done that. That would have taken neurosurgery beyond the belief of any person. But on a very, very serious note, after 14 days, and to this day no one's explained it to me, a deal's done by the Queensland Council of Unions, the POA and the MOA, and all of a sudden the lights come back on. And once those lights went back on, it was we were in the rear end of a disaster, because our key industrial power was gone in support of these 1,007 workers and their families, and it's never been made public why. My only understanding would be is that if the POA and the MOA were told that they're going to be deregistered if they didn't back down, there'd be special legislation be enacted to fine them back to work or whatever. The POA and MOA rank and file was certainly very militant. There were some very militant people in particular at Swanbank and at Gladstone, and it was also important that dispute was won because it was important for a technical reason. Once Tarong came online properly, it was a much more automated power station, and Stanwell eventually come on properly. They were automated power stations that could be run by management, so you didn't need the skilled what you might call grey collar workers to do it. So we were always on the back foot after that, and this is where I'll try to put this talk into a much more personal example. Is that what we did is that in the community is that we formed in the left wing community is that we formed a trade union support group. We used to meet every week on top of the Wharfies Club. We used to have a big meeting space there. And sometimes in the early days of the dispute, we'd have up to 400 people attending. I remember Dan O'Neill making some of the most beautiful and wonderful working class speeches you could imagine. I remember having arguments with Dan where he thought I was a broken down Stalinist, and probably still does. But it was so wonderful to see people like Dan and the whole team of people from the Street March days and whatever come and give great support to the SEQEB workers. My first experience on a picket, if I remember rightly, was my first arrest was out at Redbank, I think it was, and I was with Don Brown. Don Brown ended up as the head of the Miscellaneous Workers Union, but he also ended up as an industrial commissioner. He's been a great mate of mine for well over 40 years, and he rang me up because at the time we were both co-chairs of Trade Unions Against Apartheid, and also on Mondays I used to man, when I was home from sea, the Australian Peace Committee offices that were in the old Trades Hall in Albert Street, where sadly it got demolished and an IBM building got put up, but that's another story. But so the Australian Peace Committee, we were sort of like the unwitting foreign policy arm of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but whether unwitting or not, we certainly pushed the Soviet line. But anyway, so Don rings up and says, "Look, my brother-in-law's been sacked. He's one of the, and there's a picket line. We're going to have a protest line at either Redbank or Ipswich SEQEB depot." He said, "You interested in coming along?" I said, "You pick me up and I'll be there, mate." So we went, and 7 of us got lumped along with Bobby Gibbs, who was a great comrade and I think an ex-ET organiser. I think maybe, somewhere along the line. Yep. And so that was the first. The next one was around Barden Way. I got lumbered there. And then the third one, we had meetings at the Wharfies Club and the Trade Union Support Group, and we decided that we'd be supporting the ETU, which was having its National Executive meeting in Brisbane on April the 17th, 1985, at Lamington Street Depot. Most people know where the Powerhouse Museum is. That's it there. And so several hundred of us turned up that day, including a wonderful Catholic priest by the name of Father Dick Pascoe, and two other Catholic priests. They had a giant cross, and hundreds of others of us. And we held the line there until there was this overwhelming police presence. And the Queensland Police, like if you look at demonstrations in Victoria and places, or New South Wales, you often see horses used to break demonstrations and pickets up. In Queensland, that's never been the way. Queensland's always been based on, we'll bash you into submission. And I'll take my hat off to the Queensland Police for that. They have bashed plenty of us. And they did a good job on me that day. I was with about 10 other merchant seamen. I was really proud of, we're a little union, but we had some great militant members, and 10 of us. The whole ETU National Executive was arrested that day, including the former secretary, Dick Williams. Dick had a broken arm at the time, and he got arrested. There were 10 merchant seafarers, lots of students, and just lots of wonderful trade unionists from all around Brisbane. We got lumbered. I was locked arms with several other picketers, and they tried to break it. And anyway, we held on, and they sort of singled me out and give me a bit of a strangulation, and I ended up with 4 assault and 1 bodily harm charge out of it. A police officer broke his wrist because he missed my head and smashed the tarmac. And this, it's all humorous, but it wasn't too humorous when they got me back to the watch house. I can give you the drum. But anyway, so we get thrown into the watch house. We're all getting processed, and we have to front the magistrate that day. And the magistrate comes up with this great idea that says, Mr. Carnegie, you've been arrested 3 times. You're obviously a malcontent professional picketer. You won't be going to any more SEQEB depots because you're going to be barred for 200 metres from the depots. You can't go anywhere near it. I said, well, I won't be copping that, Your Honour. He said, what? I said, yeah, I won't be copping that. And they said, you've got to sign this or otherwise you're off to prison. I said, I guess I'm off to Bogger Road then. And I was off to Bogger Road. So that night I got processed in Bogger Road, and I think the only kind word I heard from a screw in the whole time I was there was this guy who was processing me, telling me to strip and look up my bottom and everything else. And he said, you shouldn't be in here. I said, you reckon? You reckon? So anyway, I get put in the remand section. It's late at night. In those days, Bogger Road, the remand section had 30 people in it, 30 cells. You all had your individual cell. It was beautifully. It's sort of like like the Sheraton Hotel, without the carpets, the bed, a running shower, water. But what they did have, they had pipe music. You could listen to the ABC. It was piped. It had a little sort of, you couldn't turn it off, but it was piped. And what the prison officers did, it was one of those really beautiful things that you rarely see from people who are supposed to be fellow trade unionists. They used to put it just off the channel. So you would just be listening all night to it just off the channel, and then on top of that, you heard the screams and the bad dreams of prisoners all around Bogger Road. So, it was the night of horrors. And so that's how things went. The first morning in the yard, we assembled. You had to get out at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, you were woken. The door was open, and then 6:30 you had to stand to attention. You had to have your bunk made, and then the day started, which consisted of walking up and down in the remand yard. There was no work because you're on remand, and getting to know other people in the remand yard. And I did. There were some real characters I met there. And once they realised I wasn't going to sign the bail conditions, they sort of befriended me. A couple of the guys who were on murder charges, they said, "Oh, you're all right, you won't sign bail conditions." A guy called Les Toshak, he wrote a poem that I got published for him in the Seamen's Journal. Somewhere along the line, he got a sharp object and cut a tattoo that was on his hand off. He said, "Look at me cut the tattoo off my hand." He didn't even blink. I said, "Oh, that's amazing, Les." Really impressive. Another guy was, I think his name was David. He was a 6'6" Aboriginal guy, built like a brick shithouse, with hair that Jimi Hendrix would have been proud of. We're there. He was a great guy. He used to, have a bit of fun with people. Someone would disrespect him, so he sort of pile drive their head into the cement. But, that only happened once or twice, so it was pretty good. And on about the 5th or 6th day, because they used to give us 2 courier mails for 1 courier mail for 30 people. But anyway, on about the 5th or 6th day there was an old guy in the remand yard who spent most of his life in prison. He said, "Bob, come and have air." He said, "That's Dave, isn't it?" I said, "Well, it's a guy holding up a bank who's an Aboriginal, who's 6'6", with hair like Jimi Hendrix." So anyway, Dave comes over and we're talking. I said, "Have you seen the page 3 of the Courier Mail of the bank holder?" He said, "Is that the one they reckon I was in?" I said, "It wasn't you." He said, "No." And I said, "Thank you." He said, "Yes. And Bob, you tell everyone here that it wasn't me." I said, "I certainly will." So, so these are the sort of characters you meet. They're all working class people. They're all battlers. There was this really great young Aboriginal fella who was like 18 or 19. And he had to go up to Maroochydore for a heroin drug problem that he was involved in. And anyway, one day there were 4 young fellas there from Logan who were there for car stealing or whatever. And the conversation took place about drugs, and they were going on. They said, we dropped speed, we dropped whatever, but we'd never put anything in our arms. And the young Aboriginal guy said, quick as a word, like it was that sharp, he said, "Hey man, don't tell me about your hang-ups." It was something else. But what I'm just trying to explain here is that although it was tough being in the prison and the food was shit and the conditions were awful and there was always an underlying threat of violence, on May the 8th, when I had to go back to the Magistrates' Court to sign, to see what was going to happen, whether I'd get another sentence or whether it would be repealed or whether they'd cancel the bail conditions or whatever, those guys told me, particularly the big Jimi Hendrix guy, he said, "Bobby, you don't go signing those bail conditions." I said, "Oh, no." I said, "There's absolutely no chance." I certainly wasn't going to sign them. I wasn't going to sign them on principle, but I certainly wasn't going to sign them and one day end up back in the remand section with one of these guys, because that'd be the stone cold end of me. So what happened, I went in on May the 8th and the bail conditions were, I was free. They dropped the bail conditions. The same court didn't keep impressing for me to sign the bail conditions, which is somewhat unusual. After that, in my personal experiences, I had these problems with certain union leaderships. And one of the things that happened, and if I go back a couple of months, in March there was a German cruise ship came out to Australia. And the SEQEB workers and us, we got some leaflets and were giving them to the German tourists in English and in German, just about the struggle of how the ILO, International Labour Organisation, rights had been destroyed by the Jalki-Petersen government and so forth. And I was collecting money for the SEQEB workers in a covered can, and eventually I got arrested by the police again, and they confiscated the tin. But this is the weird part, and this is where I started thinking some trade union leaders are starting to toe a certain line. And my assistant secretary of the Siemens Union called me up because he'd seen me on TV getting lumbered about collecting this money. And I went up on the Monday morning, and I got carpeted saying that you've misplaced workers' money, you've been delinquent in it. I said, but the police arrested me and took the can. I said, I didn't lose it. He said, no, you're completely, utterly irresponsible. I said, all right. So I went down to the pub that was down the road and drank about 25 rums in about an hour and a half, and went back to have my little chop at him, but he'd gone home and gone somewhere. And anyway, I went down to the ETU and paid $147.20 into their strike fund because I felt, for some weird reason, I felt that it was my fault because I'd been told it was. And then we get the money back, the $147.20 is paid back to the ETU because they'd confiscated it illegally. But it started giving me this feeling that in Australia, you can be militant, even in left-wing unions, you can be militant up to a point. And if you start going past what the point of respectability is, you're in danger of being ostracised. And that is precisely what happened to me during the SEQEB dispute. Because in August, there was a section, I knew some people who were in a political organisation, and they said, oh, there's a rumour going around, Bob, that you're, after jailing and the arrests and the bashings and everything else, you're too scared to go on a picket line again. I said, what? So I broke my neck getting to a picket line, of course, you know. And the picket line was in August on Exhibition Wednesday at the exhibition grounds at the ECA. So we got maximum attention. We got arrested, about 20 of us. We went, including Bernie Neville. We got arrested and got processed, and I got fined $500 out of that, and under the Electricity Continuity Supply Act, which eventually was thrown out by the High Court. But I then got carpeted again by my own union about, why are you getting arrested in picket lines? You've done enough. But is the question about, can you ever do enough when you're fighting injustice or fighting tyranny? What's enough? No, it's that question. Is everything based on enough, or is it that we should resist tyranny? And I thought it was that we would resist tyranny, no matter what the cost. And that can leave you out on a limb. And it certainly left me out on a limb. I had all the problems I had, and I had many with the police and with others. It was that interaction within the union movement that I had that for me left the most sour and difficult taste within my mouth. The in December, I was, long before I met Melissa, is that I was with a girl and a young woman, and we were lying in bed at 6 o'clock on a Friday morning in 1985, and you get a knock on the door, and really strong knock on the door. Open up. I said, who's this? I open up. It's 3 bailiffs from the Supreme Court of Queensland. They said, we're here to collect $600 in fines. These were the fines I got from the alleged assaults of police officers and whatever. I said, what? I said, I'm not paying it. They said, yeah, don't pay it. And they said, we'll be back on Monday and we will confiscate all the property in your house that we consider that we can sell at auction up to the value of $600. And he said, that'll mean the bed, the TV set and the lounge. And it was extraordinary. So I went and paid the $600 fine, but it was probably that bailiff situation out of all my interactions with the state that I found the most upsetting. That they could just barge in your house and demand property and payment of fines that were done in an industrial setting. Look, I know I've taken up a lot of time, and I'm really sorry. I hope I haven't bored you too much. Is that December sort of saw to some degree the end of the SEQEB dispute. The ETU was deregistered, I think, for 6 months in December. People were starting to drift off. There's a Lawson poem, part of it says that I've seen the sudden tears of beaten men. And probably that sums up some of my lasting memories of the SEQEB dispute. The sudden tears of beaten men. But in effect, that they weren't beaten. They were knocked down, they were dragged out, they were hurt. We suffered a defeat, but the organisation was still alive to fight another day. And as Stewie will tell you in his report, it's a good report about the rebuilding of electrical distribution and maintenance in this state after a long period of darkness. But if SEQEB had been fought properly, if the trade union movement had united in a much more solid way with the ETU, if there hadn't been so much window dressing. For example, in August, 16,000 trade unionists, 6 months into the SEQEB dispute, marched to Lang Park and we had a big meeting at Lang Park. But that meeting wasn't the start of a renewed action campaign. That was the window dressing for the funeral of the SEQEB dispute. After the SEQEB dispute, what happens in the Australian labour movement? There's the dollar sweets decisions. There's the BLF's deregistered. The deregistration bill comes in late 1985 in Victoria, but the federal deregistration happens in 1986. In the Robe River Pico Wallsend dispute, it happens in the deunionisation of the Pilbara, and then the big ones start happening. CRA, which is Rio Tinto, starts deunionising the Pilbara. BHP start coming along with it. The mining industry becomes deunionised. Coal mining in Australia. If anyone had told me in 1985 that coal mining would be, when there wasn't 1 ounce of Australian coal was mined non-union, that 15 years later, less than 15 years later, in fact 12 years later, that they'd be operating, they'd turn union mines non-union like they did up in Kestrel, the CRA mine, but probably only 30 or 40% of Australia's coal now is mined union. It's just catastrophic. And this is what happens when you don't try to at least make some stand. Now, some people will say that it's the economics, it's the political situation, it's unbeatable, but it's not true. Okay? The Scandinavian countries didn't go down this mass path of deunionisation. Germany had a lot of problems, but they didn't go down this mass path of deunionisation. And even Great Britain, with all the horrors they undertook, the level of deunionisation in Britain was far, far less than what's happened in this country, where in fact, and there's been this lack of understanding, well, not even so much, there's this lack of a capacity within most of the leadership of the Australian, not all, but most of the leadership of the Australian trade union movement to take these issues head on. We didn't 40 years ago, and we're still paying the price today. But look, that's how I'll wind it up. I hope it made sense, and I hope that it's not too, it's not my part of this talk today isn't a happy one, but and the memories I have out of SEQEB are very mixed. But the fact that, as I said before, that we stood up, that we fought injustice, that we fought tyranny, is that in the end is the most important thing. A very famous US socialist, communist once wrote, he said, he led his name was William Z. Foster, he was maybe the greatest labour organiser in US history, a former Wobbly who ended up becoming the chairman of the Communist Party of the United States. He wrote after the 1919 steel strike, where 400,000 workers speaking 20 different languages stayed out on strike for 100 days, where 22 men were murdered and 10,000 were arrested. He wrote a pamphlet after it, and it was called What Means a Strike in Steel. And he said that no strike or struggle is wholly ever lost. That it's far, far better to fight a losing fight than to have never fought at all. And most tellingly, he said that an unresisting working class will soon find itself on a rice diet. And so with those wonderful words, I'll wind this talk up. Thanks.